Welcome to this explainer. When we look back at November 9th, 1989, it's so easy to picture the dramatic end of the Cold War as this incredibly carefully orchestrated event. But the truth is, it wasn't just some top-down geopolitical victory. It was actually a wildly complex chain reaction ignited by a spectacular historical accident. As we'll see, the real story is way more chaotic, deeply human, and honestly, just absolutely fascinating. Let's get right into it. But before we dive into that unbelievable sequence of events, we really have to ask ourselves a seemingly impossible question. How on earth did one of the most terrifying military barriers in human history, a literal symbol of absolute totalitarian control, ultimately become undone by a fumbled press conference? Well, let's take a look at the sheer scale of the obstacle we're actually talking about here. To really grasp the immense stakes of this history, just consider this number, 155. Because we have to remember, this wasn't just a simple fence separating two neighborhoods. No, it was a physical and ideological divide stretching exactly 155 kilometers, built to entirely encircle West Berlin, literally locking East Germans inside their own country. And the brutal reality of that divide? It was stark. We're talking about two separate walls, standing 4 meters tall, separated by a mined corridor ominously known as the Death Strip. By 1989, this thing was fortified by 302 watchtowers. It was heavily guarded by soldiers who were under strict, unwavering orders to shoot anyone attempting to defect. For nearly 3 decades, it was the ultimate symbol of a divided, frozen world. Which brings us to our first section, the spark, an accidental opening. So, on November 9th, 1989, despite all that concrete, the barbed wire, and the massive military might, the spark that finally ignited the fall of this monstrous wall was, of all things, a bizarre bureaucratic mistake. During the live television broadcast, East German official Günter Schabowski was just supposed to announce some minor tweaks to travel regulations. Basically, changes meant to ease public pressure, definitely not open the floodgates. But Schabowski hadn't actually been in the meetings where this was decided. He was just handed an unreviewed note right before going on air. And when a journalist pressed him on the specifics, a clearly confused Schabowski scanned the paper in front of him, just desperately trying to find an answer. Notice the specific phrasing here. Pressed on when the new travel rules would begin, Schabowski hesitated and uttered these immortal words. As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay. He had absolutely no idea the rules were actually supposed to start the next day and with strict application processes in place. Those fateful fumbled words were broadcast live, and that news spread instantly across West German media, which, importantly, was widely viewed in the East, creating an immediate, practically unstoppable public frenzy. All right, let's move on to the next part, the powder keg, catalysts for collapse. Now, a spark is pretty harmless unless it lands on something highly flammable, right? The first major catalyst turning East Germany into a massive powder keg was a huge shift in Soviet policy. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union had introduced reforms like perestroika and glasnost, meaning restructuring and openness. But crucially, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev doctrine. Instead of using Soviet tanks to crush dissent in allied nations like they used to, he adopted a policy playfully dubbed the Sinatra Doctrine by his spokesperson. Basically, Soviet bloc countries could now do it their own way, just like the song. Without the constant threat of Soviet military backup, the hardline East German regime suddenly found itself completely isolated. And on top of that, a chain reaction of border openings had been destabilizing the Eastern Bloc all year long. Back in May 1989, Hungary actually began dismantling its border fence with Austria. This escalated in August with the Pan-European Picnic, where hundreds of East Germans utilized a temporary border opening to escape right into the West. Suddenly, the Iron Curtain literally had a gaping hole in it, and tens of thousands of East Germans started fleeing the country by taking the long way around.
This takes us to the third piece of the puzzle, the peaceful revolution, the power from within.
You see, while all these geopolitical shifts were happening up above, a massive, peaceful revolution was boiling up right from the ground below. Superpower leaders get a lot of the historical credit for ending the Cold War, but the true, largely forgotten architects of the wall's collapse were the everyday citizens of East Germany. They were the ones stepping out into the streets, actively risking their own freedom, facing down the secret police, and peacefully protesting communist policies simply because they had had enough.
And this was a deeply grassroots movement driven by incredibly diverse groups across East German society. I mean, you had Lutheran pastors like Christian Führer organizing peace prayers that served as safe havens for organizing. You had bold women like Katja Havemann and Bärbel Boly founding the New Forum, which became a major opposition group. And you had intellectuals, artists, and writers bravely publishing protest poetry just to test the regime's limits.
Their incredible courage ultimately culminated in massive weekly Monday demonstrations. Originating right from those prayer meetings at St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, these protests swelled from just a few hundred people to hundreds of thousands. They marched peacefully through the streets, chanting this powerful, unifying slogan, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. They were demanding democratic reform and human rights, and honestly, the regime simply didn't know how to stop a massive crowd that completely refused to be violent. And that brings us to the main event. The night of November 9th, the wall comes down. This was the exact moment the irresistible force met the immovable object. The immense pressure of that peaceful revolution we just talked about violently collided with Günter Schabowski's little bureaucratic error at the border checkpoints. Following Schabowski's press conference, West German news anchors like Hans-Joachim Friedrichs went on the air and boldly declared to the divided nation, "This 9 November is a historic day. The gates in the wall stand open wide." Hearing this, thousands of East Germans literally left their homes and began to swarm the 6 border checkpoints between East and West Berlin, boldly demanding the immediate passage they were just promised on television.
Now, you can imagine this led to a critical, incredibly tense standoff. The border guards were completely overwhelmed. They were frantically calling their superiors, but no one in the crumbling East German leadership would actually give the order to use lethal force against such a massive crowd. Finally, at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, Commander Harold Jaeger made a historic, totally independent call. Around 11:30 p.m., he ordered his men to open the gates. The crowd surged through into West Berlin, sparking those wild emotional celebrations that we all still remember seeing footage of today.
Let's look at the aftermath in consequences and legacy beyond the physical divide. The immediate aftermath was just euphoric. Citizens who were quickly nicknamed wallpeckers or Mauerspekte literally rushed to the wall with their own hammers and chisels, physically chipping away at the concrete themselves for souvenirs. This civilian dismantling actually led to the official military demolition of the wall starting in June 1990, paving the way for the formal and incredibly rapid reunification of Germany just 339 days later, on October 3, 1990. However, to really understand this history, we have to look way beyond the physical rubble. As scholars and authors like Peter Schneider noted, long after the physical concrete was hauled away, a profound psychological barrier persisted in the consciousness of the newly reunited nation. They actually call this the Mauer im Kopf, which translates to the wall in the mind. Because while the physical wall was completely removed and the political integration was super fast, the social and economic reality was completely asymmetrical. East Germany was rapidly deindustrialized, and their economic systems had to suddenly compete with a highly efficient West. This left a lingering resentment and division between the less affluent East, often referred to as Aussies, and the prosperous West, known as Westies. Which really leaves us with a vital question to ponder today. If a 155-kilometer death strip, heavily guarded by soldiers and watchtowers, can be dismantled practically overnight by a historical accident and the sheer will of the people, well, how long does it take to tear down the invisible, ingrained walls within a society's own mind? It's a pretty stark reminder that while monumental events can destroy physical barriers, true unification requires much, much more than just a hammer and chisel. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.